Picture a merchant vessel cutting through dark water, bow pointed toward the port of Ugarit, one of the wealthiest trading cities the ancient world had ever produced. Below deck, the cargo holds are packed with wine from Crete, copper ingots from Cyprus, and rare purple dye worth its weight in precious metal. The crew is exhausted but eager, weeks at sea, and now the Syrian coastline is finally visible on the horizon. Except something isn't right. There's smoke where the city should be. Not the familiar haze of cooking fires or incense drifting from temple altars. Something darker, something wrong. As the ship draws closer, columns of black smoke become unmistakable. The great harbour, a place that had welcomed vessels from every corner of the known world for centuries, is choked with wreckage. Bodies drift on the surface of the water, and when the crew finally make shore, they find a city that had stood for over 1,000 years reduced to ash and rubble. The palace burning, the temples shattered, the streets silent except for the dead, and the strangest part of all, no one can say who did this or why. This actually happened. Around 1177 BC, the city of Ugarit was destroyed, and it did not stand alone in its fate. Within the span of a few short decades, virtually every major civilization ringing the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had governed Anatolia for centuries with iron-willed authority, vanished so completely that later generations forgot it had ever existed. Archaeologists only rediscovered it some 3,000 years afterward. Mycenaean Greece, the Bronze Age world of warrior kings, golden death masks, and the legends that would later inspire Homer, imploded. Its massive palace complexes were put to the torch and left empty. Egypt, the most enduring civilization on earth, barely held together. The pharaohs kept their grip on power, but the glittering new kingdom was shattered beyond recovery. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon fell. The great trading cities strung along the coasts of Syria and Palestine were destroyed and never rebuilt. Within a single human lifetime, an entire interconnected world came apart. This wasn't one empire swallowing another. This was something far stranger. A collapse so total, so widespread, and so mysterious that historians are still arguing about it today. There is no single cause that fits neatly. No lone enemy that can take the blame. No simple explanation for why everything unraveled at once. Some scholars point to the Sea Peoples, shadowy raiders whose origins remain fiercely debated. Others cite earthquakes, prolonged drought, or cascading famine. Some argue that rigid palace economies simply buckled under pressures they were never designed to handle. And the unsettling truth is that all of these explanations are probably correct, in one measure or another. It wasn't one disaster. It was everything, all at once. There's something in this story that cuts close. That feeling when you realize something that seemed immovable was in fact brittle all along. That is precisely what 1177 BC teaches us. The Bronze Age world looked invincible. And then, suddenly it wasn't. Before we can understand how everything fell apart, we need to understand what was there to fall in the first place. Because the late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BC, was not some primitive era of isolated chieftains scratching survival from reluctant soil. This was one of humanity's first genuine experiments in globalization. An intricate web of civilizations stretched across thousands of miles, bound together by trade routes, royal marriages, and diplomatic treaties that would make many modern international agreements look simple by comparison. Start in Egypt. The new kingdom was at its absolute zenith. Rameses II, Rameses the Great, ruled for 66 years and left monuments so colossal they still dominate the landscape today. Egypt controlled territory stretching from Nubia in the south all the way through the Levant. Its grain stores could feed millions. Its gold mines made it the financial center of the Bronze Age world, and Egyptian correspondence from this period carries the easy confidence of a power that has never seriously questioned its own dominance. To the north, in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire commanded a territory larger than modern Turkey. Their capital, Hattusa, was a city of massive stone fortifications, elaborate temples, and palace archives filled with thousands of clay tablets documenting everything from military campaigns to bread distribution. The Hittites were simultaneously masterful warriors and accomplished diplomats. They fought Egypt to a hard standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot engagements in the ancient world, and then sat down afterward to negotiate what may be history's first formal peace treaty, written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. Copies of that agreement can be seen at the United Nations today. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean Greece was flourishing. Not the Greece of philosophy and democracy. That was still 8 centuries away. This was the Greece of enormous stone palaces, warrior aristocrats, and burial chambers heaped with golden treasure. Sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were not merely fortresses. They were sophisticated administrative centers, literate bureaucracies managing intricate economies. Linear B tablets, the earliest known form of written Greek, record obsessively detailed accounts of everything from chariot wheels in storage to measured quantities of perfumed oil. These palaces controlled vast territories, coordinated labor forces numbering in the thousands, and maintained trade networks reaching from Italy to the Near East. Further east, the Assyrians and Babylonians held dominion over Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where civilization itself had first taken root. They possessed libraries, law codes, astronomical observations, and mathematical systems, sophisticated enough that we still use their foundations when we divide an hour into 60 minutes or measure angles in degrees. Along the Levantine coast, wealthy city-states like Ugarit, Byblos, and Tyre served as the great trading hubs where goods and ideas flowing from 3 continents converged. But what makes this era truly remarkable is not the power of any individual civilization. It is the degree to which these civilizations were in constant communication, trading, negotiating, complaining, gifting, and occasionally fighting, but always within a shared framework of international relations. The Amarna letters prove this beyond any reasonable doubt. These clay tablets, discovered in Egypt, are diplomatic correspondence between pharaohs and other rulers of the age. The tone is startlingly familiar. Kings address one another as brothers. They exchange lavish gifts, gold statues, lapis lazuli, fine textiles. They grumble when those gifts arrive late or fall short of expectations. They arrange marriages between royal families and haggle over bride prices the way merchants negotiate contracts. One letter features a Babylonian king essentially nagging the pharaoh about a delayed gold shipment. Another has a Cretan ruler apologizing because a plague outbreak has disrupted copper exports. These are not primitive warlords posturing at each other across a wilderness. These are sophisticated statesmen maintaining complex relationships across thousands of miles. And the trade networks underpinning all of this were staggering in their reach. Tin, essential for making bronze, came from as far away as Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall in Britain. Copper came primarily from Cyprus. Baltic amber made its way south through Central Europe into the Mediterranean. Ivory arrived from Africa, incense from Arabia, purple dye from Phoenician workshops, grain from Egypt, wine from Crete, olive oil from Greece. All of it moved constantly through interconnected routes maintained by merchants who understood both seafaring and diplomatic protocol. A single shipwreck off the Turkish coast, discovered by a sponge diver in 1982, and now known as the Uluburun wreck, contained copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, glass beads from Mesopotamia, Egyptian amulets, Mycenaean pottery, African ebony, Baltic amber, and goods from at least 7 distinct cultural regions, all packed into one merchant vessel roughly 50 feet in length. This was not some exceptional gift shipment between kings. This was routine commerce. One ship carrying a snapshot of the entire Bronze Age world. These civilizations had writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex legal systems, standing armies with standardized equipment, and formalized international trade agreements. Some cities had paved streets and drainage systems. Palaces maintained sophisticated storage facilities for managing surplus resources. Scribes kept meticulous records of everything from grain deliveries to religious festivals. This was a literate, militarily advanced, diplomatically networked world that had been functionally stable for centuries. And then, somewhere around 1200 BC, it all came apart. To understand why the Bronze Age collapsed the way it did, you first need to understand something about the metal that gave the age its name. Bronze is not a single metal, it is an alloy, a carefully balanced mixture of copper and tin. And that seemingly simple fact shaped the entire structure of Bronze Age civilization. Copper on its own is too soft for serious work. You can shape decorative objects from it, fashion basic tools, but forge a sword from pure copper, and it will bend the moment it meets resistance. Add tin, however, roughly 10 to 15%, and the result is something transformative. A metal hard enough to hold a cutting edge, strong enough for weapons that can actually kill people, durable enough for tools that survive real use. Bronze was the steel of its age, the material that separated advanced civilizations from everyone else. Here is the problem. Copper deposits are reasonably common. Cyprus had enormous copper mines. Anatolia and the Sinai had significant deposits as well. But tin is rare, frustratingly, almost perversely rare. The major tin sources were in distant places like Afghanistan, possibly Cornwall in Britain, perhaps parts of Central Asia. We are talking about locations thousands of miles removed from the great Bronze Age civilizations that depended on the metal most. No kingdom, regardless of its wealth or military power, had easy access to both copper and tin in the quantities required to sustain a Bronze Age economy. And this was not a luxury problem. Bronze was not like ivory or exotic dye. Pleasant to have, but survivable without. Bronze was the foundation of military power, agricultural productivity, and economic development. You could not maintain an army without bronze weapons. You could not keep farming at scale without bronze tools. You could not assert dominance as a civilization without producing bronze on an industrial scale, which meant that international trade was not optional. It was not something kingdoms engaged in when they felt like it. It was a structural necessity embedded in the very foundation of how these societies functioned. Think through what that dependency actually meant. Egypt needed tin from Afghanistan just to keep its armies equipped. The Hittites needed copper from Cyprus to maintain their military edge in Anatolia. Mycenaean Greece required both copper and tin from territories beyond its control. Every major civilization depended on supply chains moving through lands they did not own. maintained by relationships with peoples they barely understood. The Uluburun shipwreck, that merchant vessel sleeping on the Turkish sea floor, had 10 tons of copper ingots in its hold, each cast in a distinctive shape resembling an animal hide. About a ton of tin sat alongside it, probably from Afghanistan, though the exact source remains debated. Glass beads from Mesopotamia, jewelry from Canaan, scarabs from Egypt, Mycenaean pottery, African ebony, Baltic amber, meaning this single ship carried materials that had originated at the northern edge of Europe, moved south through the continent, and found their way into the Mediterranean basin. Pomegranates and figs, weapons and tools, raw materials and finished goods representing at least 7 different regions, all aboard one vessel roughly the length of a modern semi-truck. And that ship was probably one of hundreds making similar journeys every season, moving copper west from Cyprus, tin east from the mountains, finished goods bouncing between ports. A constant circulation of materials that kept the entire system alive. This kind of interdependence, systems theorists would tell you, creates what they call tight coupling. Every part of the system depends on every other part. When everything functions, the efficiency is remarkable. Specialization flourishes, production scales upward, sophisticated supply chains emerge. Cyprus focuses on copper mining because it can reliably trade for tin. Egyptian grain feeds populations across the Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery ends up in Hittite palace storerooms. Everyone benefits from everyone else's strengths, until something breaks. In a tightly coupled system, failure in one component does not stay local. It cascades. A disruption in Afghan tin supplies would not be merely an Afghan problem. The shock would travel across every trade route, reaching civilizations that never knew where their tin originally came from. Armies would find themselves unable to produce adequate bronze. Agricultural tools would wear out and go unreplaced. Economic systems built around bronze production would begin to fail. The parallels to our own world are not subtle. The pandemic revealed how a single bottleneck in global shipping could generate shortages across dozens of industries simultaneously. A semiconductor factory idled in Taiwan affects car production in Germany and the United States. A drought in one nation's wheat belt sends bread prices climbing on the other side of the planet. We have constructed a system of extraordinary efficiency that is also, by its very nature, extraordinarily brittle. The Bronze Age was the first time in human history that something similar existed at civilizational scale. The Uluburun ship is remarkable for what it reveals about what ancient peoples could accomplish. Maintaining trade across thousands of miles, navigating open seas, managing logistics of bewildering complexity, keeping goods flowing across centuries. But that ship sank. 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin vanished into dark water. Multiply that kind of loss across dozens of vessels. Add the disruption of trade routes by warfare. Factor in production failures triggered by drought and disease. Imagine what happens when Cyprus's copper output slows at precisely the moment tin shipments from the east become unreliable. Suddenly, isolated problems stop being isolated. They become a systems crisis. The very interconnectedness that made Bronze Age civilization so extraordinary becomes the mechanism of its undoing. When the web held, it held everything together. But once it began to tear, there was nothing to slow the unraveling. The sea peoples, raiders from the edge of the known world, they came from the sea. That is what the Egyptian records say. They arrived in ships beyond counting and left destruction in their wake. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, a name that tells us almost nothing except the direction from which they appeared. And more than 3,000 years later, we still cannot say with certainty who they actually were. You can see them carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu. Ramesses III commissioned these reliefs to commemorate his victories over them, and they remain among the most dramatic images to survive from the ancient world. Ships locked in naval combat, warriors wearing distinctive feathered headdresses, battle scenes showing Egyptian forces repelling wave after wave of invaders, and beside the images, inscriptions that read like records of something close to the end of everything. No land could stand against their advance. From Hatti and from the Aegean coasts, from places known and unknown, they came. Their forward momentum preceded by flame, their passage leaving behind desolation where living kingdoms had stood. This is not diplomatic language. This is existential terror barely contained inside the formal structure of royal propaganda. The Egyptians recorded names for these groups: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. They catalogued them the way one might catalogue different species of catastrophe, and scholars have been arguing ever since about who each group actually was. The Peliset are likely the Philistines, the same people who appear in the Hebrew Bible settling along the Canaanite coast. The Shekelesh may have come from Sicily, though the linguistic evidence is thin. The Denyen might have connections to Greece, perhaps displaced Mycenaeans searching for new homes after their own civilization collapsed. Or they may have been Anatolians, Sardinians, or some desperate confederation assembled from the survivors of multiple cultures, held together not by shared identity, but by shared need. Nobody agrees. And the deeper you go into the scholarship, the more clearly you see how little we actually know. We have Egyptian inscriptions claiming victory. We have archaeological traces of destructions that may be connected to these groups. We have layers of burned cities and abandoned settlements across the region. But assembling these fragments into a coherent account of who these people were and what they were attempting, that is where everything becomes murky. Here is what makes the Sea Peoples both compelling and deeply relevant to understanding the collapse. We cannot say with confidence whether they were the cause or the consequence. Were they the destroyers of Bronze Age civilization, a horde of raiders who swept through the Mediterranean, toppling everything in their path? Or were they themselves refugees, populations displaced from civilizations already crumbling, driven into desperate movement by forces they had no power to resist? Consider the timing. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian records at precisely the moment when everything else is falling apart. The Hittite Empire is collapsing. Mycenaean Greece is burning. Trade networks are fraying. Climate evidence points to severe drought across the region. And into this mounting crisis come these mysterious raiders, appearing at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. That is either the most unfortunate coincidence in history, or it tells us something important about the nature of what was really happening. The traditional story, the one Ramesses III wanted you to believe, is seductively clean. Barbarian invaders arrived from outside the system, attacked the great kingdoms, and brought civilization crashing down. Clear cause, clear effect. Egypt stands as the last bastion of order against encroaching chaos. But archaeological evidence increasingly complicates this picture. The pattern of destructions does not follow the logic of a coordinated military campaign. Cities do not fall in sequence, as you would expect from an advancing army moving in a clear direction. Instead, the destruction is scattered and inconsistent. Some cities burn violently. Others show signs of gradual abandonment without any evidence of attack. Some regions experience multiple destructions spread across decades. Others appear to collapse from internal pressures with no indication of outside force at all. And then there is Ugarit. We have the last letters sent from that city's king, written just before its destruction around 1190 BC. He is pleading for help. Enemy ships have been spotted. The situation is desperate. What strikes readers of these letters is that they do not sound like the words of a ruler confronting a sudden, unexpected assault. They read like a king who has been managing an escalating crisis for years. A kingdom already hollowed out, now facing a final blow it simply cannot absorb. The letter was addressed to the King of Cyprus, requesting military aid. Whether it was ever sent is unknown. If it was, the help never came. Perhaps Cyprus had troubles of its own. Perhaps no troops could be spared. Perhaps, by the time the message arrived, it was already too late. Ugarit burned. The archaeological layer from around 1190 BC records complete destruction. Bodies in the streets, collapsed houses, the palace reduced to rubble. Everything that had made this city one of the great trading centers of the ancient world erased. Were the sea peoples responsible? Probably, at least in part. The timing aligns, but were they a disciplined invading force executing a planned campaign? Or were they something more desperate? Former sailors and merchants and soldiers whose own cities had already fallen now turned to piracy and raiding because there was nothing else left. The more carefully you examine the evidence, the more the sea peoples begin to look less like the barbarians who tore down civilization, and more like what civilization produces when it tears itself down. When trade networks collapse and cities start burning, populations are displaced. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of people find themselves without homes, without livelihoods, without any structure to return to. Former subjects of kingdoms that no longer exist, sailors whose familiar trade routes have vanished, soldiers whose commanders can no longer pay them. These people do not simply disappear. They organize. They acquire ships. They move toward wherever resources might still be found. In a world already coming apart, they become one more pressure on societies barely managing to hold together. Not the origin of the collapse, the visible face of it, the symptom made flesh, arriving on the coastlines of the dying. Ramesses III claims to have defeated them. Perhaps he did, at least at Egypt's borders. But the more important question is not whether Egypt won that particular battle. It is why that battle was happening at all. Where did all these displaced people come from? What destroyed their homelands? What set them in motion? Answer those questions, and you stop seeing the sea peoples as the mystery. You start seeing them as the clue. To find that clue, you have to leave the shoreline behind. Set aside the inscriptions and the carved battle scenes, and look instead at something quieter. The slow accumulation of evidence written not in stone, but in mud, in pollen, in the rings of ancient trees that never knew they were keeping records. Because long before Ramesses had his victories carved into temple walls, something seems to have gone wrong with the world itself. When scientists extract a core of sediment from the bottom of a lake, they are in a real sense slicing through time. Each layer represents a year, settling silently in the dark. Trapped within those layers are grains of pollen shed by every plant growing in the surrounding landscape. Wheat, barley, olive trees, drought-resistant scrub, desert shrubs. Count the grains within each layer and you can reconstruct, with remarkable precision, what the landscape once looked like and how it shifted over the centuries. Researchers examining sediment cores from across the eastern Mediterranean, from Cyprus, from the Levant, from the regions that were once the breadbaskets of Bronze Age kingdoms, have found something striking in the layers corresponding to around 1200 BC. Pollen from cultivated crops and from oak forests drops sharply. Pollen from drought-tolerant plants rises. The landscape is thinning. Fields are failing. The living cover of the earth is pulling back. Cave formations tell a complementary story. Stalactites and stalagmites grow at rates that reflect local rainfall. Thicker layers in wet periods, thinner layers when conditions are dry. The chemistry of the calcite encodes information about temperature and precipitation. Around the same period that the palaces began to burn, those underground records suggest the skies over the region had already begun to close. Tree rings add another layer of testimony. Trees do not care about kings or treaties. They simply respond to available water. A wide ring means a good year. A narrow ring means drought. In places where ancient timber has survived, reused in buildings, preserved in dry climates, dendrochronology allows researchers to line up those rings like a barcode and read what the climate was doing decade by decade. The sequence around 1200 BC includes clusters of abnormally narrow rings, suggesting multiple consecutive years of poor growing conditions, possibly spanning decades. None of this means there was a single catastrophic mega drought that struck every field in the same year. Nature is rarely that tidy. But when researchers mapped the accumulated pollen data across Cyprus and the Levant, a pattern emerged consistent with severe and sustained aridification spread across generations. Not a bad harvest or two, but a fundamental shift in climate that made agriculture itself progressively more precarious. Now step out of the laboratory and into the landscape. You are a farmer outside Ugarit, or a Hittite peasant in central Anatolia. You know nothing about precipitation anomalies or atmospheric circulation patterns. You only know that the rains have become unreliable. Springs run lower each year. The barley never quite fills out properly. The olive trees set less fruit. The first bad year, the palace opens its granaries. That is, after all, the entire purpose of a Bronze Age state. Taxes collected during good years become reserves against bad ones. The second bad year, the granaries open again, but the stores are thinner. By the third consecutive bad year, the scribes are keeping careful count of what remains. Rations are reduced. Families begin selling off land, and then, in desperate cases, selling their own children into debt bondage simply to survive. And in some regions, at almost exactly the moment the climate was turning against them, the ground itself began to move. Geophysicist Amos Newell spent years building a case that the late Bronze Age collapse coincided with what he termed an earthquake storm. Not one single catastrophic event, but a sequence of major earthquakes rippling along active fault lines across the eastern Mediterranean over a span of decades. The region sits atop a tangle of tectonic boundaries: the Hellenic Arc, the Anatolian fault systems, smaller local faults beneath the Aegean and the Levant, where stress in one zone can trigger movement in another. The archaeological record appears to preserve some of these events in collapsed stone and shattered mud brick. At Mycenae, a destruction layer from the late 13th century BC includes walls with stones that have slid sideways off their foundations and masonry that has fallen outward in patterns consistent with violent ground shaking rather than enemy assault or deliberate fire. Tiryns, another Mycenaean fortress not far away, shows similar evidence. Cracked walls, shifted blocks, buildings collapsed in ways that match what modern engineers document in earthquake zones. The rebuilding that followed appears to have been done by fewer people, with less skill, in simpler forms, as though a culture were attempting to stand up again on ground that refused to stay still. Further east, Troy goes through multiple destruction phases within this general period. One layer shows walls thrown down and foundations twisted in ways that many archaeologists interpret as seismic rather than military in origin. At Ugarit, heavy stones in certain buildings have fallen inward from multiple directions simultaneously, and walls lean at angles that suggest the ground moved beneath them. It is entirely possible that Ugarit experienced both, earthquake first, then fire and human violence in the chaos that followed. When societies are already under pressure, disasters rarely arrive separately and politely. Put drought and earthquakes together within rigid, top-heavy political systems, and the picture darkens considerably. Drought alone has never been enough to end a civilization. People relocate, switch crops, reorganize. Earthquakes alone have never done it either. Cities get rebuilt on top of their own rubble all the time. But drought and earthquakes compounding each other within palace economies that had no flexibility built in. That is a different situation entirely. Smaller harvests mean less grain flowing into the palace as taxes, but the palace still has to feed its retainers, its soldiers, its scribes and craftsmen. It still has to fund military campaigns and pay for imported metals and luxury goods to keep the elite class cooperative. Less is coming in while the same amount or more must go out. As stores tighten, prices rise. Ordinary people feel the pressure first and most acutely. Malnutrition creeps in. Children do not grow as tall. Immune systems weaken, and illnesses that would normally pass become fatal. Famine does not arrive as an abstraction. It arrives as fights breaking out at ration lines, as theft from fields, as soldiers stationed to guard granaries who begin to question why they are protecting food for other people's families while their own go hungry. Social trust corrodes. Banditry increases. Local officials under pressure from above and below begin falsifying records or taking bribes to divert what little grain remains. The very structures designed to keep everything stable start to rot from the inside. Now add earthquakes. A city that might just barely have scraped through a run of dry years suddenly finds its storage jars smashed and its walls cracked. Temples collapse. Palaces are damaged. Rebuilding requires labor and resources already in critically short supply. Some places manage to pull themselves back together in a simpler, reduced form. Others are simply abandoned, their survivors drifting toward whatever larger centers still appear to be functioning, swelling the ranks of the desperate in those places too. Among the clay tablets recovered from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, there are letters from what was probably one of the final kings of the empire, addressed to Egypt, begging for grain shipments, not requesting, pleading. The Hittite heartland was inland, far more vulnerable to rainfall variability than the Nile Valley, with its reliable annual flood. When the rains failed in Anatolia, the Hittites turned to their southern neighbor. One surviving letter states it simply and without ceremony: "There is famine in my land. Send grain so that my people may live." This is years before the Sea Peoples appear in Ramesses' reliefs, long before Egypt's famous defensive battles at the Delta. The greatest empire in Western Asia is reduced to begging for emergency food shipments. Famine is not only a biological event, it is a political one. Hunger makes people question why they are obeying a king who cannot keep them alive. It makes peasant revolts more likely, palace coups more appealing, and local strongmen more attractive alternatives to a distant, failing central authority. Weakened states are bad at precisely the two things they most need during a crisis: maintaining diplomacy and mounting defense. When your administration is triaging food supplies, it is harder to sustain far-flung trade networks. When your soldiers are guarding granaries, it is harder to defend borders. When your treasury has been emptied buying grain, it is harder to pay for the horses and weapons a chariot army requires. So when displaced populations begin moving, some of them eventually becoming what Egypt will call the Sea Peoples, they are not moving into a stable, well-defended world. They are moving through a landscape of cracked palaces, hungry populations, and rulers already standing at the edge of losing control. Before the ships came, and before the cities burned, nature itself seems to have shifted against the great kingdoms. The climate grew less forgiving. The earth moved underfoot, and the Bronze Age civilizations, magnificent and interconnected as they were, found themselves facing a world that was changing in ways their systems had never been designed to absorb. To understand what was rotting from within, you have to picture these palace complexes not as ruins, but as living institutions. Storerooms stacked floor to ceiling with jars of oil and wine, granaries carefully measured and apportioned, workshops where bronze was poured and cloth was woven and chariot wheels were fitted and repaired, corridors where scribes pressed wet clay with their styluses while reading inventory lists aloud. This was the beating heart of the late Bronze Age, the palace economy. In most of these kingdoms, Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, the Hittite Empire, the city-states of Syria and Canaan, the palace was not simply where the king lived. It was the center of production, storage, redistribution, and long-distance trade. Farmers delivered grain, wool, and livestock as tax payments. Craftsmen worked for rations within palace workshops. Merchants sailed out carrying palace-owned goods and returned with copper, tin, ivory, and luxury items that went straight back into royal storage. On a good day, it was an elegant machine, something like centralized economic planning, centuries before anyone had words for such a concept. The palace collected what the countryside produced, kept meticulous accounts, and redistributed those resources outward as wages, rations, diplomatic gifts, and religious offerings. In theory, everyone existed within a single coordinated system. No one outside the elite was wealthy, but if the records are accurate, most people at least knew where the next allocation of food would come from. In practice, this system balanced everything on the head of a pin. the more completely resources were concentrated within a single node, the palace, the more everything depended on that node functioning without interruption. A bad harvest required dipping into reserves. A disruption in trade routes meant scrambling for alternative sources of metal and grain. A king dying without a clear successor sent shock through the entire network. Centralization brought efficiency. It also brought fragility. And it brought inequality on a scale that is easy to underestimate. The same linear B tablets that document grain allocations and oil inventories also reveal a stark division between those who moved within palace walls and those who worked outside them. High officials and aristocrats at Mycenaean Pylos received land grants, enslaved workers, and generous rations. They hunted and feasted, commissioned fine pottery and perfumed oils, attended chariot displays and religious festivals. Storerooms overflowed with exotic goods shipped from hundreds of miles away. For the peasant families who actually grew the grain and raised the animals, the picture looked entirely different. They appear in the tablets as numbers. So many men, so many women, so many children assigned to fields or flocks. Their obligations were heavy. A fixed portion of whatever they produced was owed as tax. A portion of their time was owed as corvée, forced labor on royal projects, road building, fortress repair, seasonal work in palace fields. When the climate shifted and harvest shrank, those demands did not automatically shrink with them. In times of abundance, people could tolerate the burden. The palace provided genuine security, storage against bad years, protection from raiders, religious authority that maintained the cosmic order everyone depended on. The king's wealth, though vast, could be justified as necessary for the functioning of the whole. But as drought dragged on, and earthquakes cracked walls and toppled storehouses, that bargain began to fray. The response from the top was predictable: tightened control. In the final decades before the Mycenaean palaces burned, the administrative tablets suggest a governing class growing anxious. At Pylos in western Greece, scribes recorded the mobilization of coastal watchers stationed all along the shoreline. There are hurried inventories of rowers, chariots, and weapons. The kind of frantic record-keeping that looks less like routine administration and more like a government suddenly aware it might not be safe. Some of those tablets were still wet when the palace was destroyed. They were fired not in a kiln, but in the heat of the blaze that brought the building down around them. Whatever emergency the palace was scrambling to address, it arrived before anyone was ready. The tone visible in surviving documents from across the region shifts over the final decades of the Bronze Age, from the calm accounting of a confident administration to something tighter and more desperate. An administration trying to plug leaks in a dam while the water keeps rising. In Egypt, Ramesses III would later boast that he had fed the hungry and prevented the poor from plundering one another. The very need to make that claim suggests how close things came to unraveling. In Ugarit, letters speak of bandits in the countryside, local unrest, officials unable to keep roads safe for travel. In the Hittite correspondence, some texts describe vassals dragging their feet on tribute payments, regions growing unreliable in their loyalty, kings writing increasingly sharp letters invoking divine witnesses and threatening consequences that their diminished authority could no longer actually deliver. Under mounting stress, Highly centralized systems often respond by demanding more from the bottom in order to preserve the top. Higher taxes, stricter labor obligations, less tolerance for local autonomy. For a while, this strategy can hold things together. But there is a threshold beyond which the same approach that once stabilized the system begins, instead to destabilize it. Imagine you are a Hittite farmer surviving poor harvest after poor harvest. You are already surrendering a portion of your grain. You are already sending family members to work on royal building projects. Now, officials arrive, insisting that the full quota must be met, even though your fields yielded half what they did a decade ago. You watch grain being moved along royal roads to distant cities, while your neighbors scrape the bottoms of their storage jars. The palace warehouses are guarded, access is restricted, every measure counted. At what point do you simply stop cooperating? Archaeology offers a quiet but telling answer. In some regions, what the record shows is not that every settlement was burned. Instead, large, elaborate centers, the visible symbols of palace authority, were abandoned or drastically reduced, while smaller villages in the hills and backcountry continued on, and sometimes even grew. Fortified administrative centers go dark. Modest farmsteads keep leaving their simple pottery in the soil. There are also destruction layers that do not look like conventional military sieges. No clusters of arrowheads, no obvious points of breach in the walls. Just sudden burning concentrated in administrative quarters, as though anger had been directed very specifically at the symbols of power and obligation. It is not difficult to imagine what that might represent. Tax collectors meeting resistance instead of compliance. Local leaders deciding that loyalty to a distant king was no longer worth the cost. Communities turning on archive rooms and storehouses in moments of rage or panic, destroying the very records that defined what they were owed, what they had to give, who owned what. Some scholars have suggested that part of the Bronze Age collapse was in certain places something like a withdrawal of consent, not a planned revolution in any modern sense, more like a gradual, uncoordinated refusal, people drifting toward the hills, declining a summons, withholding support when raiders appeared on the horizon, and no help came from the palace that had always claimed to protect them. A palace economy runs not just on grain and bronze, but on belief. Belief that the palace has the right to count your harvest. Belief that the system will look after you when conditions turn difficult. Once that belief is gone, a palace is just a large and vulnerable building full of things other people want. This is worth sitting with. For kings and courtiers, the end of the palace world was unambiguous disaster. Titles erased, diplomatic networks dissolved, luxuries dependent on long-distance trade suddenly unavailable. Writing systems in places like Mycenaean Greece simply ceased to be used for centuries. Monumental architecture stopped being built. But for some people, the collapse may have felt like something closer to release. Without the palace demanding fixed quotas, farmers could keep more of what they grew. Without corvée obligations, whole seasons opened up for working their own land. Villages could govern themselves by local custom rather than by edicts from distant administrators. Trade shrank and became more local, but it also became less subject to royal monopoly. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age were extraordinary achievements. They coordinated resources across enormous distances, turned raw metal into weapons and tools, fed standing armies and priestly colleges and specialized craftsmen. They also concentrated power and wealth so completely that when the world around them grew harsher, there was almost no flexibility left in the system. Inequality deepened, trust thinned, and in the narrowing space between what the system demanded and what reality could actually provide, something began to give way. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, from within. By the time drought and earthquakes and strange ships appeared on the horizon, many of these societies were already hollow at the core. The walls still stood. The storerooms still held something. The scribes were still writing. But the web of loyalty and obligation and belief that had held everything together was quietly coming apart. The Hittites called their land Hatti, and for a time it was one of the great pillars holding up the Late Bronze Age world. If you had stood in Egypt around 1250 BC and asked a court scribe to list the major powers of the known earth, the answer would have come without hesitation: Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, and Hatti. The Hittite king was not some distant chieftain at the margins. He was a peer, a man you addressed as brother in diplomatic correspondence, who sent and received royal daughters in their marriage alliances, who exchanged gold and grain and gods with you across thousands of miles. A few centuries later, if you had asked a Greek traveler about the Hittites, you would have received only a blank look. They were gone, not merely defeated, not simply diminished, erased so completely that the entire civilization vanished from collective memory. For more than 2,000 years, the Hittite Empire existed only as a faint biblical echo, a phrase that even ancient readers did not fully understand. Their capital, Hattusa, lay buried under fields and scrubland in central Anatolia, its walls crumbled, its archives silent, its gods forgotten, waiting undiscovered until the 20th century. To understand why this disappearance still puzzles historians, you have to picture Hattusa at its height. The city sat on a rocky plateau, enclosed by massive stone fortifications that swept across the surrounding hills in great arcs. The walls rose in multiple lines in places, with towers and carefully fitted gate complexes, one crowned with lions, another with sphinxes, opening onto processional ways lined with carved reliefs of warriors, priests, and deities. Inside the walls stood temples dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, surrounded by storage rooms and courtyards and workshops and residences for thousands of inhabitants. Beneath all of this, in cool archive rooms, lay tens of thousands of clay tablets, letters from foreign kings written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, ritual texts prescribing offerings for every imaginable crisis, legal codes, treaties, inventories of grain and livestock, prayers and myths. When archaeologists finally uncovered those tablets and learned to read them, a lost empire began to speak again, and it told a story of rise and fall that carries the weight of deep familiarity. Like many late Bronze Age states, the Hittite kingdom had grown from a modest core in central Anatolia, absorbing neighboring city-states and weaving a patchwork of vassal princes and subject peoples into a single political fabric. At its peak, It controlled most of what is now Turkey and northern Syria, pressing directly against Egyptian interests in the south. At Kadesh on the Orontes River, Hittite and Egyptian armies met in one of the largest chariot battles in the ancient world. The result was ambiguous enough that neither side could claim a clean victory, so they did something unprecedented. They negotiated formal peace. The Treaty of Kadesh, carved on temple walls in Egypt and preserved on a silver tablet in Hatti, is the oldest known international peace treaty whose full text survives. It sets out mutual defense obligations, extradition clauses, and oaths sworn before the gods of both nations. Legalistic, precise, almost contemporary in its architecture. Here was a civilization sophisticated enough to invent the formal framework of international diplomacy as we would recognize it. A state whose scribes could negotiate in complex legal language, whose kings could envision a world in which enemies became partners. And in the background of those diplomatic achievements, another development was quietly unfolding. Iron. Long before iron replaced bronze as the everyday metal of tools and weapons, Hittite smiths appear to have been experimenting with smelting and working this difficult material. Iron objects from Hittite contexts are rare and were treated as prestige items, but the knowledge was present. A superpower with diplomatic sophistication, early metallurgical advantage, and centuries of institutional experience. None of it was enough. In the final century of the empire, the tablets from Hattusa begin to sound strained. There are succession disputes, brothers and cousins competing for the throne, each new king required to shore up loyalty with fresh oaths and distributions of land and titles. Every transition is a wobble in the system. Vassals in Syria begin to drag their feet, failing to deliver the tribute and troops they owe. The tone of royal letters shifts from confident command to something that increasingly resembles repeated pleading. The invocation of gods as witnesses, threats of divine punishment that the weakening state can no longer back up with real force. And the grain shipments, or rather, the absence of them. Some letters speak openly of famine in the Hittite heartland, of grain needing to be imported from coastal vassal states. Others complain that those shipments are arriving late or in insufficient quantities. Central Anatolia, where Hattusa sat, was particularly vulnerable to drought. In good years, the plateau could feed the capital and supply its armies. In bad years, it had to lean heavily on the subject territories that supplied its needs. On the northern frontier, meanwhile, the Kaska peoples, highland groups from the rough country near the Black Sea, press against Hittite borders. For centuries, the Kaska had been a persistent irritant, raiding and withdrawing into forests and hills where chariots could not follow. In the empire's final decades, references to Kaska attacks multiply. They appear to sense weakness and move to exploit it at every moment of internal disorder. One of the most haunting documents from the entire Late Bronze Age is a letter from the last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, addressed to the ruler of Ugarit. The tablet is broken and incomplete, but its meaning is unmistakable. The Hittite king reports that enemy ships, almost certainly belonging to what Egypt will later call the Sea Peoples, have attacked his coastal territories. He orders, or perhaps begs, the king of Ugarit, to send ships and troops immediately to help defend Hatti. Two palace economies, both already standing in rising floodwater, each hoping the other can still throw a rope. We know how it ended for Ugarit. Not long after that letter was written, the city was destroyed, its palaces burned, its archives fired in the same blaze that brought down its walls. In the rubble, archaeologists found that letter from Hattusa, still lying in a scribal workroom when the fire came. It had never been answered. For the Hittite Empire itself, the end is even more obscure. There is no triumphant inscription from a conqueror boasting of Hattusa's fall. No chronicle recording the city's final days. What archaeology provides instead is its usual quiet testimony. A destruction layer in Hattusa around 1180 BC, charred beams, collapsed walls, signs of intense burning in the palace and temple districts. After the fire, there is a pause, then almost nothing. The city is not rebuilt as a capital. The temples do not rise again. The bureaucracy that once filled storerooms with tablets simply disappears. In the countryside, smaller settlements continue. Life goes on in villages and on farms. But the imperial center, the place that issued orders, maintained archives, kept the roads repaired, and the vassal network functioning, vanishes. Within a generation or two, the memory of a unified Hittite empire appears to have faded from most living minds. Not everything was entirely lost. In the centuries after the collapse, small successor kingdoms emerged in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, Carchemish, Malatya, and others, sometimes called the Neo-Hittite states. Their rulers carved inscriptions in a related language. Their art preserved familiar motifs, weather gods, lions, royal processions. In their city gates, you can still feel a faint reflection of Hattusa's massive walls. But the great experiment, the centralized treaty-writing, ironworking empire that had once rivaled Egypt and battled it to a standstill, was gone. Not gradually fading into a successor dynasty, not transforming into a different but continuous civilization. Gone, dropped below the horizon of written memory. The Hittites show us what collapse can truly mean, not just political defeat, not just burned cities, but a kind of quiet deletion, an entire civilization's name and achievements lying buried in the soil, unread, while the world above moves on and invents new stories to fill the silence. Egypt had been here before. The Egyptians carried long memories of instability, of periods when central authority had fractured, when local warlords had carved up the Nile Valley, when pharaohs were little more than names inscribed on crumbling monuments. In their own historical consciousness, order was not a given. It was something you lost and then painfully, over generations, rebuilt. So when the crisis came, Egypt was not a naive empire encountering catastrophe for the first time. It was an old survivor, which made what was coming all the more significant, because it nearly finished Egypt anyway. At the center of Egypt's last great stand is one man, Ramesses III of the 20th dynasty. He came to the throne in a world already coming apart at the seams. The Hittites were wobbling. Ugarit was anxious enough to be sending desperate letters. Migrants and raiders were moving along the coasts. Grain shipments were faltering. Ramesses's inscriptions sometimes read, like a man shouting into the wind, insisting that Egypt is still strong, still wealthy, still favored by the gods, because he can feel, more clearly than anyone, how precarious things have become. His greatest test arrived from the sea. The Egyptians never used the label Sea Peoples as a single unified designation. That framing is a modern construction assembled from fragmentary records. But Ramesses III understood that something dangerous was approaching. He recorded that a coalition of foreign peoples, driven from their homelands by some earlier wave of disaster, had turned south. They came, he says, with their families loaded into ox carts, warriors advancing by land and sea simultaneously, moving through the Levantine cities and pressing steadily toward the Nile Delta. This was not a raid. It was a migration armed with weapons. Ramesses met them in 2 engagements. The first was a land battle at the approaches to the delta. The walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in western Thebes preserve a vast carved panorama of this confrontation, still one of the most dramatically realized military reliefs from the ancient world. Ranks of Egyptian infantry and archers, chariots advancing in formation. Opposite them, warriors in horned helmets and feathered crowns, carrying round shields and long swords. And among the fighters, ox carts loaded with women and children. The migrating families caught in the collision. A frozen moment of impact between a settled river kingdom and desperate mobile communities that had already burned their way through much of the eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses claims to have crushed them utterly. His scribes enumerate captured prisoners and document the grim trophies of victory in the explicit accounting style that Egyptian propaganda favored. Whether the precise numbers are accurate matters less than what the relief demonstrates. Here was a state still capable of fielding a professional army, still able to meet a major crisis with organized force rather than panic. The second engagement took place on water. The same temple walls show a naval battle unlike anything else preserved from the ancient world. Egyptian ships crash into enemy vessels in a churning tangle of oars and hulls. Archers draw bows from the deck while foreign warriors tumble into the water. The Egyptians appear to have lured their opponents into the narrow channels of the delta, where the advantage of numbers was neutralized, then struck with archers positioned on both banks and from ships at close range. In a confined engagement where maneuvering was impossible, positioning and discipline overcame raw force. If even a portion of the Egyptian account is accurate, this was among the first well-documented examples of a state deliberately engineering a battlefield to neutralize a dangerous and an unfamiliar enemy. The result, according to Egyptian records, was decisive. Surviving invaders were captured and eventually settled as subject peoples within Egypt. The delta held. That alone distinguishes Egypt from the Hittites and from Ugarit. When those same forces collided with those kingdoms, the result was obliteration. When they reached Egypt, the result was a bloody, expensive stalemate that Egypt could just barely afford. But even as Ramesses was carving triumphant images into stone, the costs were accumulating. The wars were draining. The Nile's flood cycles may have been less reliable than in earlier centuries. The tribute and revenue that had once flowed into Egyptian coffers from Canaan and Syria, a key component of the imperial economy, was drying up as those regions dissolved into chaos or slipped out of pharaonic control entirely. And inside the palace walls, things were not as stable as the monumental inscriptions suggested. Some 2 decades into his reign, a conspiracy took shape within the royal harem. We know about it through a set of trial documents that read like a meticulously preserved ancient true crime record. One of the king's secondary wives, a woman named Tai, apparently wanted her son on the throne instead of the designated crown prince. She assembled supporters among palace officials, scribes, magicians, and even members of the palace guard. Messages were exchanged. Spells were cast. Wax figures were made to harm the king. An attempt was made to recruit soldiers. The plot was eventually discovered, and the conspirators were brought before a special court. The records document interrogations, confessions, sentences, forced suicides, and executions in the controlled bureaucratic tone that Egyptian officialdom favored, chilling precisely because of how measured it sounds. For a long time, historians could not determine whether the conspiracy had actually succeeded in killing Ramesses III, or whether he had died naturally, and the conspirators had simply failed. Then CT scans of his mummy revealed the answer. Beneath the elaborate wrappings, a deep cut runs across the king's throat, down to the vertebrae, a wound that would have been immediately fatal. The embalmers had tucked a protective amulet in the shape of the Eye of Horus into the linen at his neck, as though attempting to heal. In symbol what had been done in violence. The king who had turned back the sea peoples at Egypt's borders appears to have been killed by his own household. If you wanted a single image for the fragility that the surviving Bronze Age powers had reached by this point, that would serve. A victorious pharaoh dead not on any battlefield, but behind palace walls, brought down by the very elites whose position his system had sustained. After Ramesses III, Egypt did not collapse suddenly. That is what makes it exceptional. Instead, it sank. The later pharaohs kept the same proud dynastic name, Ramesses IV, the fifth, the sixth, onward. But the grandeur increasingly became a performance of itself. Foreign territories in Canaan and Syria slipped away, absorbed by local dynasts or by new powers rising in the vacuum left by the Hittites' disappearance. Egyptian garrisons pulled back toward the Sinai and then beyond it. The broad imperial reach of the new kingdom contracted steadily toward the Nile Valley itself. Within that shrinking core, fractures spread. In the artisan village of Deir el-Medina, where specialized workers carved and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, something happened around this period that had never been formally recorded before. The ration deliveries stopped arriving on time. These were not desperate peasants. They were highly skilled state employees paid in grain and goods from the central treasury. When deliveries failed repeatedly, they did something unprecedented. They set down their tools, walked to local temples, and refused to work. The papyrus describing these events is remarkably matter-of-fact in tone. The workers demanded their rations and invoked their rights as servants of the king. Negotiations followed. Partial payments were made. Work resumed and stopped again in cycles. It is the earliest recorded labor strike in history, small in scale, but telling in what it reveals about a bureaucracy that had once fed Egypt's great building operations with clockwork precision, now struggling to keep even its most essential workers supplied. At the same time, tomb robberies became epidemic. The Valley of the Kings, once sealed with elaborate curses and protected by the state's authority, was broken into repeatedly, sometimes by men driven by hunger, sometimes, evidently, by corrupt officials working from inside knowledge. Trial records from this period document detailed interrogations about which tombs had been entered, how much gold removed, who had melted it down, who had taken a share. Survival, though, came at a price. In the generations following Ramesses III, Egypt turned inward. The glittering empire of Thutmose III and Ramesses II, of Asiatic campaigns and foreign tribute and armies campaigning beyond the Euphrates, receded into memory and propaganda. By around 1070 BC, effective central power fractured. High priests in Thebes controlled Upper Egypt, kings at Tanis held the Delta, Libyan warlords and eventually Nubian rulers carved out their own spheres of influence. Foreign dynasties would eventually occupy the throne in succession. Egypt had survived the Great Collapse, but the Egypt that emerged from the other side was not the power that had stared down the Hittites at Kadesh. Its empire was gone. Its kings were more exposed. Its attention had shifted from ambitious expansion to the more modest, anxious work of simply holding on. The Bronze Age collapse is most often framed as a Mediterranean story, and understandably so. That is where the written records are richest and the ruins most dramatic. But the late second millennium BC was difficult for a much broader swath of the world. When you lift your gaze from the Nile and the Aegean and let it travel outward, you begin to find the same general pattern repeating itself in different forms across different landscapes. Dynasties ending, cities shrinking, trade routes losing coherence, new peoples moving into spaces that older powers had vacated. The storm was wider than any single sea. Take Mesopotamia. In the centuries before 1177 BC, Babylon had been governed by the Kassites, a dynasty of foreign origin that had somehow managed one of the longest continuous reigns in ancient Near Eastern history. They were not as expansionist as earlier Babylonian rulers, not as militarily flamboyant as the Hittites, but they were steady. For roughly 400 years, Kassite Babylon served as a kind of low, humming engine of stability. They maintained the irrigation canals, copied the ancient literary tablets, sent horses and diplomatic gifts and princesses to their neighbors in Egypt and Hatti. Then, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, that long equilibrium began to buckle. Elamite armies came pushing westward from the Iranian plateau. Assyria to the north, ambitious and growing, probed southward with increasing confidence. Internal unrest mounted. Around the same broad window as the Mediterranean collapse, the Kassite dynasty fell. Babylon was sacked. Sacred statues were carried off to Elam. A parade of dynasties with short reigns and unfamiliar names followed, each leaving behind inscriptions that emphasize how much they had restored. Canals cleared, temples rebuilt, cult images returned. Every act of restoration is an implicit acknowledgement that something had been broken. Yet Mesopotamia did not disappear. Assyria managed something similar to what Egypt achieved along the Nile. It pulled inward, tightened its boundaries, endured. Smaller and more cautious than it would later become, clinging to its core cities along the upper Tigris, it continued writing, dedicating temples, navigating the turbulence around it. Assyria contracted, absorbed the shocks of the period, and waited for the world to settle. If you drift further east, across the Zagros Mountains and toward the Indus Valley, you encounter a region that had already experienced its own form of unraveling. The great cities of the mature Harappan civilization, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, had flourished during the 3rd millennium BC. They built standardized brick houses, straight streets, elaborate drainage systems, and left behind an undeciphered script pressed into small seals. By the time the Mediterranean was enjoying its late Bronze Age prosperity, those cities were already fading. Climate shifts that weakened the monsoon and moved rivers from their old courses, changing trade patterns, internal social transformations. The exact causes remain debated, but by the 2nd millennium BC, the urban core of the Indus world had begun to fragment. Populations shrank, monumental buildings were abandoned, craft production became more localized and more varied. The tightly integrated system breathed outward, dispersing into a looser patchwork of towns, villages, and regional traditions. By the time the shocks of 1200 BC were rolling through the Mediterranean, communities in the Indus region were already living in a post-urban world, navigating drought and river changes and new arrivals on their frontiers. Further still, in what is now China, the Shang dynasty had ruled portions of the Yellow River Valley for centuries. They left behind oracle bones inscribed with one of the earliest known Chinese writing systems, bronze ritual vessels of remarkable sophistication, and a court culture bound to divination and communication with ancestors. Around 1046 BC, a few generations after the Mediterranean's worst years, the Shang were overthrown by a new ruling house, the Zhou, who claimed the mandate of heaven to justify their rebellion against a dynasty that had morally forfeited its right to rule. This was not a mysterious, undocumented collapse, but a transition between ruling elites, remembered in later texts, and reflected in changing burial customs and ritual practices. Is the Zhou conquest of Shang directly connected to the fall of Ugarit and the end of the Hittites? Almost certainly not in any direct causal sense. These were largely separate worlds. There is no clay tablet from Hattusa mentioning a king in distant China. No oracle bone asking about events at Troy. And yet, when you pull back to a broad enough vantage point, the global map around 1200 to 1000 BC appears speckled with transition, dynasties ending, old centers dimming, new ones emerging from the rubble or the shadows of what came before. In the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, the aftermath felt especially stark. When historians speak of a dark age following the Bronze Age collapse, they do not mean that people became less intelligent or less creative. They mean that the things which leave bright, readable traces in the archaeological record, monumental architecture, administrative writing, long-distance luxury trade, faded or disappeared. Linear B, the syllabic script used to maintain palace accounts in Mycenaean Greece, vanished along with the palaces themselves. For roughly 4 centuries, the Greeks kept no written records we can recover. Scribes vanished into silence. The great fortified complexes at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were abandoned or reduced to scattered, irregular settlements. In many areas, populations appeared to have declined. People moved into defensible hilltop villages or spread across isolated farmsteads. Long-distance trade networks that had once moved Cypriot copper, Canaanite jars, Egyptian faience, and Mycenaean pottery across the entire Mediterranean shrank, became patchier and more local. For later Greeks, looking back centuries from the vantage of Homeric poetry and early city-states, this period between the fall of the palaces and their own time existed as a kind of hazy, half-remembered era of wandering heroes and scattered chieftains. But in regions often left out of the quick summaries, new patterns were already quietly taking shape. Iron technology was spreading through communities in Europe north and west of the old Mycenaean world, where bronze required the coordination of distant supply chains, tin from one place, copper from another. Iron ore was far more widely available across the landscape. It was harder to work at first, demanding higher temperatures and different techniques, but once mastered, it made society significantly less dependent on the kind of fragile long-distance networks that had both sustained and ultimately undermined Bronze Age civilization. By the 12th and 11th centuries BC, early Iron Age cultures were emerging in Central Europe, laying foundations for peoples the classical world would later know by very different names. On the Levantine coast, survivors of the collapse were already pivoting toward what would come next. Among them were the Phoenicians, city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, heirs to Canaanite traditions, experienced sailors and traders who had spent the Bronze Age as relatively minor but useful nodes in the larger palace network. After the collapse, with many of the great palaces gone and the old trade routes in ruins, the Phoenician cities found themselves in an unusual position. They had ships, they had sailors, they had a deep tradition of seaborne commerce, and suddenly they faced almost no competition. The great royal fleets of Mycenae and Ugarit were gone. Hittite regulation of Anatolian metals had evaporated. Egyptian power had pulled back to defend its core. Into that vacuum, Phoenician merchants sailed. At first cautiously, probably retracing broken lines of exchange and filling gaps left by fallen partners. Over generations their reach expanded into Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, North Africa, and eventually beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. They founded trading posts and colonies along the way, stepping stones that would in time become whole cities. Among them, one would loom very large in later history, Carthage, on the coast of what is now Tunisia. But even before Carthage rose, the Phoenicians reshaped something more subtle and more enduring than any single city. They refined and disseminated an alphabet. The late Bronze Age writing systems, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, the Aegean syllabic scripts, had all required long training and a professional scribal class to use them. The Phoenician script took a radically different approach, reducing language to a small set of consonant signs, around 22 characters that could be combined to write almost any word. Simpler to learn, faster to use, and far easier to adapt to languages other than the one it was originally designed for. As Phoenician sailors carried their goods westward, they carried those letters with them. Greek traders adopted the system and added vowel signs, creating the Greek alphabet. The Etruscans adapted that. The Romans adapted the Etruscan version. The letters taking shape in your mind as you listen to this trace their lineage through all of those transformations, back to Phoenician signs scratched on pottery and clay. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single synchronized global catastrophe. China's Shang fell later. The Harappan cities had been fading for centuries before. Assyria and Egypt bent without quite breaking. But across a vast belt of the ancient world, from the Aegean Islands to the plains of Mesopotamia, a particular way of organizing human life, palace-centered, bronze-dependent, plugged into formalized networks of long-distance exchange, had reached its limits. Some societies disappeared into myth and rubble. Others shrank, adapted, and waited. And in quieter corners, hilltop villages and coastal harbors, iron-working communities and Phoenician docks, people were already working out new answers to the oldest of questions. How to build a life when the world you knew no longer exists. When modern historians attempt to make sense of all this, the droughts, the earthquakes, the displaced populations, the burning palaces, the silent archives, one name comes up again and again: Eric Klein. Klein is an archaeologist and historian who drew together decades of scattered evidence and published it in a slim, deliberately provocative book called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. The title points to a specific year, a single hinge moment, but the argument inside is almost the opposite of what the title implies. Klein's central point is that there was no single cause, no lone villain, no one catastrophic year that knocked civilization off its foundations. It wasn't just the sea peoples. It wasn't just drought. It wasn't just earthquakes, rebellion, or any new technology. It was all of these things simultaneously, layered, interlocked, amplifying each other inside a world that had become extraordinarily interconnected, and because of that, extraordinarily vulnerable. A perfect storm. To explain how this works, Klein borrows concepts from the study of complex systems, a field that includes ecologists, economists, and engineers trying to understand why power grids fail, why financial markets crash, why bridges that seem structurally sound suddenly give way. Picture the late Bronze Age world as a network. Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean, Ugarit, Cyprus, Assyria, Canaan, each with its own rulers, its own gods, its own language and traditions, but none of them genuinely independent. Copper comes from here, tin comes from there, grain from this river valley, timber from that mountain range, horses, ivory, glass, diplomatic marriages, written treaties, expected tribute. Each palace is a node, each trade route is a thread, each alliance is a knot, pulling the whole structure tighter. For a while, this degree of interdependence is a profound strength. A bad harvest in one kingdom can be cushioned by imports from a neighbor. A local war can be de-escalated by appeals to great kings who have too much invested in stability to let the system tear itself apart. Problems are absorbed and distributed across the network rather than concentrated in any one place. But interdependence carries a shadow side. When too many parts of the system face stress simultaneously, the connections that once absorbed and distributed shocks begin instead to transmit and amplify them. Think of a spider's web in a rising wind. A gentle gust makes it sway, but the structure holds. A single branch brushing one edge bends a few strands while the rest carry the tension. But bring multiple branches down across the web from different directions at the same time, and eventually the web doesn't bend. It tears. In the late Bronze Age, those branches came in many forms at once. Decades of drought turned productive farmland into dust. The pollen records, sediment cores, and isotope data all point toward the same pattern of progressive drying across the eastern Mediterranean. Sequences of major earthquakes ran along active fault lines, shaking ports and palaces that had either never faced such stress before or had grown complacent within their impressive-looking walls. Raids and migrations arrived not just from the sea peoples, but from hungry neighbors and restless subjects everywhere. People given more incentive to move because the great powers that had once kept order were suddenly visibly struggling. Internal palace economies that had functioned adequately in times of plenty began to fail under scarcity, producing the predictable consequences. Officials hoarding supplies, farmers abandoning fields, soldiers going unpaid, trade routes fraying under the accumulated pressure of all these compounding failures. None of these factors alone would necessarily have been fatal. Egypt had survived famines before and recovered. The Hittites had weathered prolonged wars and dynastic crises and rebuilt afterward. Cities had burned and been reconstructed. What Klein and others propose is that in this particular window, too many of these shocks struck too many parts of the interconnected system in too short a time. The result was not a smooth, gradual decline. It was a series of lurches, tipping points and cascades, dominoes falling into other dominoes. You can trace one possible chain through the evidence like following a crack spreading through glass. Prolonged drought weakens agriculture across inland regions. Harvests shrink. Granaries empty faster than they can be replenished. Famine follows. The people with the least cushion, smallholders, landless laborers, those already in debt to the palace, are hit first and hardest. Some starve quietly, others move, and those who move do not travel as merchants carrying sealed letters and proper credentials. They arrive as desperate migrants, or as raiding bands, or as hired soldiers willing to fight for whoever can still pay. Those migrants and raiders put pressure on frontier zones and coastal cities, any place that still appears to have food or resources. The raids make sea travel more dangerous. Merchants become reluctant to risk ships and cargo when the return on investment has become uncertain. Convoys require more armed escorts, which require more grain and silver to maintain. Trade volume shrinks or grows more erratic. Bronze production, which depends entirely on moving copper and tin reliably across long distances, begins to falter. States that depended on imported metals and foreign timber and exotic goods to keep their elite classes cooperative and their armies equipped find themselves in an increasingly impossible position. They cannot pay soldiers indefinitely with promises. They cannot repair temples with prayers alone. They cannot retain scribes without feeding them. Some kingdoms respond by squeezing their own populations harder. Higher taxes, more forced labor, less tolerance for local autonomy. That drives more discontent. More people withdraw from the official system to manage however they can on their own. As some states weaken or fall, their refugees become the next state's incoming problem. Ugarit's final desperate appeals for help become Cyprus's influx of displaced people, become Egypt's battle against the sea peoples at the Nile Delta. Each failure triggers the conditions for the next. The collapse is not a single event, but an unraveling feedback loop, a cascade in which every breaking point creates additional strain on everything still holding. Not all scholars accept this picture in its entirety. Some argue that framing everything around 1177 BC as a single synchronized moment makes the collapse appear sharper and more coherent than it actually was. They point to regions that declined earlier or recovered later, to cities that lingered on, to evidence that in some places the transition was a protracted and drawn-out fading, rather than any sudden crash. In their view, what we call the Bronze Age collapse is a convenient label applied from a great distance to what actually felt, from the inside, like an exhausting generational grind of adaptation, conflict, and improvisation. Both perspectives can be true simultaneously. On the ground, individuals experience specific droughts, specific wars, specific kings rising and falling. Viewed from sufficient distance, those overlapping experiences line up into a coherent shift in how human societies across the Eastern Mediterranean were organized and what was possible within them. Complicating all of this is the quiet spread of iron technology already underway in these same centuries. Iron was not invented by survivors picking through the ruins of the Bronze Age. Small amounts had been worked earlier, sometimes from meteorites, sometimes from rare surface deposits. But during the Late Bronze Age, it remained a marginal material, a curiosity, occasionally a luxury item. Bronze was still dominant. Bronze, however, chained you to trade. You needed copper and tin in the right proportions, sourced from specific distant locations, transported through specific trade routes controlled by specific powerful parties. That dependency helped maintain the authority of palace elites. They controlled access to the networks that converted raw materials into weapons, tools, and prestige goods. Iron broke that pattern. Iron ore is far more widely distributed across different landscapes. The techniques for smelting it are more demanding, requiring higher temperatures and different skills. But once learned, they grant a degree of local self-sufficiency that bronze never could. As the Bronze Age palace systems faltered, knowledge of ironworking began spreading. Not overnight, not in any clean burst, but unevenly and steadily, seeping from region to region. In the long run, this shift would partially democratize metal working, reducing the stranglehold that palace monopolies over specific mines and trade routes had maintained for centuries. How much this contributed to the collapse itself versus shaping what emerged afterward is genuinely uncertain. The evidence is incomplete and the timelines are blurry. But iron's spread is easy to imagine as one more subtle pressure on an already stressed order. and as one of the fundamental reasons the world that took shape after the collapse looked so different from what had come before. And here is perhaps the most unsettling part of all this. We are attempting to understand a complex, multi-layered catastrophe through a very small opening. Many of the archives that might have explained what happened burned when the buildings around them did. Clay tablets survive fire better than papyrus or wood, but not all tablets were properly fired, and not all cities burned in just the right way to preserve them. Entire archaeological sites lie buried under modern towns, farms, and unexplored hillsides. Shipwrecks sleep on seabeds not yet surveyed. Oral traditions that carried memories of these years have been lost, or transformed into myths so layered they are no longer legible as history. What we have are fragments, a desperate letter from Ugarit, a burned administrative layer in a Canaanite town, a drying trend in a lakebed sediment core, a sudden prevalence of iron knives in a graveyard that previously held bronze, a name, Sea Peoples, carved by an Egyptian scribe who recorded victory and nothing more. Klein's perfect storm is a carefully reasoned reconstruction, not a solved problem. The Bronze Age collapse remains partially in shadow, its causes overlapping like waves, its timelines blurred, its human experiences mostly unrecorded. Perhaps that is precisely why it continues to compel. You are looking at the dim outline of a disaster large enough to reshape multiple civilizations, but not quite legible enough to fully explain. Your mind reaches into the gaps and imagines the choices made, the fears carried, the ordinary days lived under extraordinary strain. When the dust finally began to settle, the map of the Eastern Mediterranean did not look empty. It looked smaller. The great royal names that had once dominated diplomatic correspondence and treaty tablets were gone, or reduced to shadows of their former selves. No more great king of Hatti, no more Mycenaean overlords dispatching ships and fine goods across the Aegean. Instead, what you would have found were clusters, hilltop villages clinging to defensible ridges, modest towns rebuilding inside the scorched shells of older cities, farmsteads pushing into land that had once been measured and taxed and monitored by palace scribes, and which was now simply there for whoever could hold it. Populations dropped in some regions, but people did not vanish. They reorganized. Power broke into many smaller pieces, local chiefs, clan leaders, small kings carrying grand titles, and very modest resources. The long, elaborate ribbon of international diplomacy frayed into shorter, more local strands of regional politics. From a distance, historians call these the Dark Ages. From the inside, for the people living through them, it probably felt less like darkness and more like uncertainty. Fewer royal storehouses to fall back on, fewer foreign luxuries, fewer professional armies moving under glittering banners, but also, in many places, fewer tax collectors arriving at the door, fewer forced labor obligations, fewer demands from distant rulers who had once controlled every aspect of economic life. In that looser, more fragmented landscape, new kinds of players began to find room to move. One of the most consequential of these occupied narrow strips of coast in what is now Lebanon and northern Israel. We call them the Phoenicians, not a unified kingdom, but a chain of independent city-states. each with its own king, its own harbour, its own patron gods. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. During the Bronze Age, these ports had been useful but relatively minor participants in the larger palace network, supplying timber from Lebanon's forests, trading purple dye, serving as intermediaries for Egyptian and Hittite commercial demands. After the collapse, with many of the great palaces gone and the old trade routes in ruins, the Phoenician cities found themselves in an unexpected position. They had ships, they had experienced sailors, they had a deep tradition of seaborne commerce, and suddenly they faced almost no competition. The royal fleets of Mycenaean and Ugarit no longer patrolled the sea lanes. Hittite regulation of Anatolian metals had evaporated. Egyptian power had retreated to defend its own core. Into that vacuum, Phoenician merchants sailed, cautiously at first, probably reweaving broken trade connections and filling the gaps left by fallen partners. Over generations, their horizons expanded dramatically. Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, North Africa, and eventually beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. They founded trading posts and colonies that would in time grow into cities. Among them, one would loom especially large in later history: Carthage, founded on the North African coast, which would eventually become a commercial powerhouse and military rival to the rising powers of Italy. But before Carthage, the Phoenicians gave the world something more subtle and far more enduring. They refined and spread an alphabet. Late Bronze Age writing systems, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, the Aegean syllabic scripts, all required years of specialized training and a professional scribal class to operate. The Phoenician script approached the problem differently, reducing language to roughly 22 consonant signs that could be combined to represent almost any word in any language. Simpler to learn, faster to use, and dramatically easier to adapt for new tongues. In a post-palace world, where no single institution could afford to maintain large scribal bureaucracies, that accessibility mattered enormously. Greek traders adopted the system and added vowel signs. The Etruscans adapted the Greek version. The Romans adapted the Etruscan. The letters taking form in your mind as you listen to these words are the distant descendants of signs scratched on Phoenician pottery thousands of years ago. Inland from the Phoenician coast, in the highlands of Canaan, other new identities were taking shape. Scattered villages began appearing in the early Iron Age, whose material culture looked subtly distinct from their neighbours. Fewer pig bones in the refuse heaps, distinctive pottery styles, small four-room houses repeated with notable consistency across the landscape. Over time, these highland communities would come to understand themselves and be understood by others as Israel. Their exact origins are debated. Some scholars see them primarily as local Canaanites who reorganized socially and religiously in the aftermath of the collapse, moving into the hills as the old city-state structures fell apart. Others allow for an influx of groups from outside, passed through the filters of later biblical narrative. The truth may be a mixture. Old populations reshaped by new ideas and occasional newcomers. What matters for this story is that in a region once dominated by Egyptian garrisons, Hittite diplomacy, and Canaanite city kings, small-scale local politics like Israel began to emerge and persist in the space that the great powers had vacated. On the coastal plain, another group was settling in. Archaeology reveals a cluster of cities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, whose pottery, architecture, and domestic customs in the early Iron Age carry striking similarities to the Aegean world. Oven types, decorative styles, certain foods and drinking habits point toward connections with Mycenaean Greece. Egyptian texts mention a group called the Peleset among the Sea Peoples who attacked their borders. Many scholars connect these threads and suggest that the Philistines of later biblical memory were at least partly descended from displaced maritime groups, people whose homelands in the Aegean or Anatolia had been shattered by the same forces that destroyed the Bronze Age palaces, who ended up carving out new territory on the southern Levantine coast. If so, then the conflicts between early Israelite communities and the Philistine cities, stories that echo faintly in the biblical accounts of Samson and of David and Goliath, were not simply local quarrels. They were one small corner of the enormous reshuffling that followed the collapse, playing out in the margins of a world still sorting itself out. Further northwest, across the Aegean, Greece went through what later historians label its Dark Ages. The Mycenaean palaces burned or were abandoned. The linear bee scribes disappeared. The great stone tombs were no longer built. Populations in many areas declined. Settlements retreated to defensible hilltops. Trade with the East dwindled to almost nothing. From the outside, it looked as though civilization in Greece had simply stopped, but beneath the silence of lost writing, other things were happening. Local chiefs governed from modest fortified halls. Oral traditions thrived. Long memorized narrative poems that would centuries later be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey, preserving faint, distorted memories of a world of palaces and bronze-clad warriors that had long since vanished. Slowly, contact with the Eastern Mediterranean resumed. Phoenician traders arrived, bringing goods, and more importantly, their alphabet. Greek communities adapted it to their own language, and after centuries without writing, literacy returned in a new and far more accessible form. By around the 8th century BC, something genuinely new had crystallized in the Greek world: the polis, the city-state. These were not palace economies with courts of dependent nobles. They were communities that defined themselves through citizenship, exclusive in ways we would find troubling, often limited to free adult males, but structurally different in kind from what had come before. They debated, they voted, they argued in public assemblies. Some experimented with tyranny, some with oligarchy, some in places like Athens with forms of radical citizen democracy. From those small, contentious, argumentative cities would come the philosophical schools, the dramatic traditions, the mathematical and scientific investigations that later ages would gather under the heading of classical Greek civilization. It is a strange thought to sit with. The ideas that would so profoundly shape what we call Western civilization grew, in significant part, from the long and painful recovery from a systems collapse in the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Throughout all of this, the Phoenician voyages, the Israelite hill communities, the Philistine settlements, the slow Greek recovery, ran the quiet, uneven spread of iron. Iron tools and weapons did not instantly level the playing field between strong and weak. Smelting still required skill, fuel, and infrastructure. Elites still tried to control access to trained smiths, but compared to bronze, iron was genuinely harder to monopolize. If your landscape held iron ore, and your community mastered the techniques, you could eventually equip your farmers with stronger plowshares and your soldiers with serviceable weapons, without needing secure access to distant tin mines or the goodwill of foreign copper merchants. Power dispersed. Instead of a small number of great kings controlling narrow choke points in the metal trade, a much wider variety of regional powers could draw strength from more local resources. Looking back across these centuries, the paradox is difficult to ignore. Collapse destroys. It burns cities, breaks networks, shatters the lives of people who had no part in creating the conditions that brought everything down. It dismantles institutions that took generations, even millennia, to build. But in destroying, it also clears. The palace economies that had monopolized trade and literacy, that had defined how labor and hierarchy were organized for centuries, disappeared or shrank. In the space they left behind, new technologies, new social structures, and new ways of thinking could take root. Alphabetic writing, iron tools, citizen assemblies, small regional kingdoms with distinct identities and local gods. Many of the features we associate with the classical world, Greece, Israel, Phoenicia, and eventually Rome, trace their emergence back to the centuries immediately after 1177 BC. None of this was inevitable. Different storms, different accidents of history, and the pattern might have looked entirely different. The people living through those generations had no guarantee that anything stable or better would appear on the other side. For them, it was simply life. Rebuilding, adapting, seizing whatever opportunity the changed landscape offered, telling stories about a grander past and hoping for a livable future. We come back, in the end, to the question that opened this story. In 1177 BC, the great courts of the Eastern Mediterranean flickered and went dark. Palaces burned. Trade routes fell silent. Scripts that had been used for centuries were simply abandoned. And we still do not fully understand why, not completely, not with the kind of clean certainty that a single cause and a single event would provide. We can sketch the outline. Drought tightening across the landscape year after year. Earthquakes running along ancient fault lines. Famine edging into the storerooms. Raiders probing coastlines already weakened by internal pressures. A web of dependencies pulled slightly too taut, then tearing at the joins. But the precise tipping point, the final letter that went unanswered, the final ship that never arrived, the final harvest that turned steady worry into uncontrollable panic, that remains beyond what the surviving evidence can tell us. The Bronze Age collapse sits in the historical record like a broken chord. We can hear the notes that came before it and the ones that followed. We cannot quite hear the break itself. Perhaps that is part of what makes it so persistently compelling. It reminds us that even with all of our archaeology, all of our climate models, all of our analytical tools. There are moments in the human story that remain just slightly out of focus. Systems rise, grow complex, hum along for centuries, and then fail in ways that even careful retrospective analysis cannot fully reconstruct. The mystery is not a flaw in the narrative. It is part of the narrative. There is a paradox worth holding as you ease towards sleep. Civilizations are fragile, more fragile than they feel from the inside, bound to climate and trade and political cohesion and the thousand small acts of trust and cooperation that hold everything together without ever being noticed. The kings of Hatti, the pharaohs of Egypt, the scribes of Ugarit, all lived inside a world that felt solid and ordained and permanent. They wrote letters and signed treaties and arranged marriages, confident that the framework they knew would endure. It didn't. The web tore. The lights went out in the palace courtyards. And yet the people inside those civilizations were remarkably resilient. When the Bronze Age order broke, families continued planting fields and patching roofs and telling their children stories about how the world worked and what it asked of them. From those small, stubborn, unglamorous acts of continuity, entirely new worlds eventually formed. The Phoenician merchant who scratched a new alphabet onto a piece of pottery, the Greek singer who shaped older memories into verse that would survive for thousands of years, the farmer in the Canaanite hills who decided to organize his community differently than the palace system had organized everything before. None of them knew they were living in the afterglow of a collapsed age. They were simply making do, making meaning, making choices. Remembering 1177 BC is not about finding a precise prediction of our own moment. It is about perspective, about recognizing that systems we treat as permanent are more delicate than they appear, and that when they change, the aftermath carries both genuine loss and unexpected possibility. Darkness and new light arriving together, inseparable. If you have traveled this far through the ruins and rebirths of the ancient Mediterranean, let the names Hatti, Ugarit, Mycenae, Thebes soften now into something quieter. Imagine the last embers cooling on palace floors, waves moving against harbours that were once crowded with ships, stars turning above new villages whose inhabitants do not yet know. They are living in the aftermath of an age. Let your breathing slow, like the long, unhurried tide between one world and the next. Rest well. Good night. If you liked the video, do not follow to subscribe.